Book Talk begins at 4 minutes and 34 seconds.
Welcome to CraftLit, the podcast for crafters who love books. My name is Heather Ordover, and I'm podcasting from where the Delaware River meets the Old York Road, New Hope, Pennsylvania.
Episode 653. I've been Sanderson. This episode of CraftLit is brought to you by our lovely patrons over at patreon.com/craftlit and our channel members at YouTube. This week we'd like to highlight Anne Blanton, Edita Niemiecka, Marcy Gessel, Shelley Allen, and Sharon Stewart. Thank you so much for your support. We could not do this without you. Well, hello. How are you? I'm vertical, but not for very long. So today we're only going to do one chapter. But I did want to give props to Thing 2, Aiden. Now, Aiden claims that this is actually my fault because I gave them the Alcatraz and the Evil Librarians books by Brandon Sanderson, which is true, but I didn't remember that they read those. I thought only Aaron did. They are still very, very pleasant, happy books to go back to when the world is crashing around you, because Brandon Sanderson has an amazing ability of finding ways to take dire circumstances and complicated, conflicted characters and make them accessible, understandable, empathizable with. And Aiden made me start listening to Brandon Sanderson's, is it Warbringer? I think it's Warbringer. And I'm halfway through the 24-hour book, and Aiden was right. The danger now is that I'm just going to feel the need to read everything or listen to everything by Brandon Sanderson, and that is dangerous because that man is the Stephen King of our era. He just does not stop writing. And both kids are, I think they're done with Mistborn, and they've gone partway through one of the other series. I can't even remember. There's so many. But yeah, so it didn't stop with Alcatraz for me. It's just kept going. And the thing that I thought was really interesting about Warbringer, which sounds like a very serious book, and it is-ish, but the same goofy and sweet sense of humor that is all over Alcatraz, the Alcatraz books, which are young adult books. They're absolutely safe for tweens. That same sense of humor pops up in different characters in Warbringer, and I was not expecting it, but it was certainly a pleasant surprise. In the middle of what could have been a very heavy book, there are really some lovely, charming, very fun characters as well. So I've been happily Sandersoned. I know a lot of you have read or listened to Mr. Sanderson's works in the past. If you haven't, this is a good one to start with. It's a standalone book. You don't have to dive into all of the Cosmere stuff. You don't have to dive into all of the Mistborn stuff. This is standalone, although Aiden tells me that there are certain characters who can world jump. So if you read more, you will see some of these characters, but not all of them, and not this world again. Although I like this world quite a lot. I think it's very interesting, and it ties into Jasper Ford's book about color. I don't remember the name of the book, and it just occurred to me that was a parallel. Anyway, Jasper Ford, the author of the Thursday Next books, I think it was his first book after the Thursday Next series, was one in a world where color was not what color is to us. And it was interesting. And I'm sure I will remember the name of the book as soon as I'm done recording. But today we are doing a standalone. It's pretty much a standalone chapter for us as well. This is chapter 9 in Emma, and it's a good one just to do on its own. I know I've mentioned the French movie Ridicule several times. We're linking out to it. There is a version available of it with subtitles that is I think free. I'm pretty sure free on YouTube. It's certainly not a new movie anymore. It was new the first time I talked about it, or newer the first time I talked about it, way back in the dark ages, early on in CraftLit days. But Ridicule is a darker take on when frivolous humor and therefore frivolous people become popular. So not Moliere, not clever, not smart, not satiric, but just ha ha ha, good at making fun of other people. When that becomes the name of the game, it's not such a pleasant game any longer, and people get hurt. Well, we know in Emma, people are bound to get hurt as well. And some of that will revolve around riddles. This is not Jane Austen. I don't think this is Jane Austen making a larger commentary on society the way that the movie Ridicule does. I think that this is Jane Austen reflecting something that was going on in their society at the time that was just everywhere. It was like books of Mad Libs in the 70s and 80s. They were just everywhere. Everybody was doing them. You say Mad Lib and people are like, oh yeah, I know, noun for fill in the blanks, got it. That was kind of the same thing. So you had these books of anthologies we've already talked about. They will get mentioned again in today's chapter. But there were also these books that were both published, like Mr. Pocketwick's book of puns and parodies, that kind of a book title. So there were these anthologies of joke books, riddle books, but riddle more than jokes. These were cleverer and more complex and a lot more wordplay. And then there were commonplace books. Now, Jane Austen doesn't use the phrase commonplace to describe a book that Harriet is working on, but it seems to me that that is exactly what it is. It's a book that Emma has shown her how to make. I am linking out to videos of how to fold your own quarto if you would like to make your own version of this commonplace book. I'm also linking out to K3N's lovely video on how to make a actual commonplace book. So she talks about how it gets used, and she goes through repurposing an old book that would have gotten thrown out if she hadn't turned her attention to it and made it beautiful again. But Harriet is using a commonplace book, and the whole beginning, end, and middle of the commonplace book story is it's generally a carryable book, so a small book or booklet or like a folded folio that you could write things down in. I know that sounds radical, right? But it was more like if you heard something funny and you didn't want to forget that joke or that funny thing, you would copy it into your book. My friend Sam, who passed away several years ago, one of the things that we bonded over was we didn't call it this at the time, but she had a commonplace book that was fabulous. She had some of the best Groucho Marx, best Mel Brooks, best Harlan Ellison. But I mean, just really, she's really good at collecting quotes. And I copied a lot of quotes out of her book into mine. And this is the same thing that was going on at this time, to the point that they're almost like autograph books too, because you pass them around and have other people put jokes and riddles and things like that into your book and sign them. And that was a way to remember people, which I think is kind of lovely. But before we get to that part, there are a couple of complicated riddles and enigmas today. We will put them up on the screen if you're watching on YouTube. We'll put them into the show notes if you are not watching YouTube. And I will explain them after the chapter, so giving you an opportunity to see if you can figure it out for yourself. One of them is an old standard. It's an old chestnut that everybody would have known when Jane Austen was writing, and the other is one that is written by a character in the book for this book. Text things to be aware of. One, we've talked before in previous books about the interesting intersection of two languages when it comes to English, that you have your Germanic, you have your Norman, you have your Angles, you have your Saxons, you have all these languages that are hitting each other at the same time. And shortly after the Battle of Hastings, everything had to kind of pick a direction, but you didn't want to lose people along the way. So they started using both words for things, both what was the upper class phrasing and the, for better or worse, the lower class phrasing. So cease and desist. One word, cease, comes from one root, desist comes from another root. A lot of legal terminology. When you hear those kind of duplicated things, that's what's going on. Here we have sorry and repent, but they are not being used like cease and desist. These are being used because they actually have different meanings. Emma will say she is sorry, meaning, oh, I feel bad about that. But she could not repent. She doesn't feel sorry enough to change anything about herself. Repentance implies some more action on your own part other than just saying, oh, too bad, I'm sorry. And that is an important distinction early on in the book. It will change, I think, as we go along. The actual use of the word common sitting room, is the sitting room that you would have guests come and visit you in, as opposed to a family sitting room, which would have just been for the family. So if you put a picture up in your common sitting room, that's because you want other people to be able to see it, other people outside of your immediate family. I mentioned that Harriet's commonplace book that she's created is folded as a quarto. And like I said, I've linked out to instructions on how to do that. Made of hot pressed paper. Anybody who has used fountain pens or watercolors, you know, there's a very big difference between cold pressed paper, which is the kind of classic watercolor paper. It's kind of nubbly and has a texture to it that the watercolors can kind of do interesting things on, because as it soaks in, it's going to soak in unevenly and give you that lovely watercolor texture. Hot pressed paper, on the other hand, is what you would want to use for pen and ink drawings or fountain pens, or the kind of amazing botanical art that my friend Pam does that I've linked out to before. She's on Instagram, Pam Thompson Art, and wow, she's just amazing. And that's using hot press paper because you need that smoothness, the thickness and the smoothness to be able to take, in her case, the ink, the watercolor, and the color pencils. Ciphers, Cyphers, in this case are like little monograms, or how, you know, in illuminated manuscripts, you'd have the first letter of a word at the beginning of a page. You'd make it oversized and ornate. That would be considered a cipher here. And trophies would be the little fiddly bits, the little curlicues and decorative extras that you could put on a page if you were trying to make your page look particularly nice. I had not heard those terms, ciphers and trophies, used that way before, so I thought that was kind of interesting. Enigmas, charades, and conundrums. So enigmas are riddles where the author gives you metaphors, symbols, language, often sub-referencing other texts, whether it's the Bible or Shakespeare or some other poem that was famous at the time. They give you these kind of obscure imagery passages, usually in verse, to give you a chance to guess what the word, the enigmatic word is that's being described. What it's kind of a who am I or what am I am, these things. Charades are much more like our modern, at least in the States, our modern 20 questions of, you know, it's 2 syllables, it sounds like. Those are presented as riddles, though, and the lines in the poetry indicate whether it's the first syllable or the second syllable. So it'll say, first, I am this, this, and this. Second, I am ending with, and it goes on from there. It builds out through the course of the verse structure. And then conundrums. These are question and answer riddles. And often they depended on words that sound like other words or look like other words. And we'll actually see that used more markedly later, much later in the book, in volume 3. Actually, it's going to take us a little while to get there. But again, there are a couple of examples of these kinds of texts in here. I will explain them afterwards. I don't want to spoil them. A prologue to the play, a motto to the chapter. This is when people quote or put a quotation from some famous author at the beginning of a chapter of their story, and then they go on to tie their chapter into something thematically with that quotation. I learned from the annotations that I have in front of me was that this was actually made very famous by Sir Walter Scott. And I love this because eventually he divulged that he made them up. Not all of them. Not all of them. Some of them were actual quotes from actual texts, but many of them he made up the quote, he made up the text that it was supposed to have come from, and that's just how it was going to be. So kudos to Mr. Scott. The course of true love never did run smooth is a line from Midsummer Night's Dream. I'm sure it would have made you prick up your ears because that is, in fact, Lysander says to Hermia in Act 1, Scene 1. Michaelmas. These terms often get used, and I always forget to look them up. Michaelmas would have been the Feast of St. Michael, and that would have been September 29th. So this is December so that we are in right now in Emma. So this would have been a reference to something that happened about 3 months, maybe a little bit less than 3 months ago. Appropriation. We are used to appropriation committees where they decide how money is going to be spent. If there's a personal appropriation, it's something that indicates that it belongs to you. It is appropriated to you, tied to you, made for you, written for you. So that's how that's being used. Going to hear a reference to Garrick, Garrick. He was a very famous actor, manager, literary talent. He was kind of all over the place. And he lived from 1717 to 1779. It was really quite a thing. There's a reference to a text from him, and that's one of the two texts that I will go over with you at the end of the episode. You probably have heard before the phrase, the die is cast. This comes from the Latin, jacta alia est, which is literally the die is cast. This was allegedly, I don't know if there's any actual historical proof, but allegedly it was Suetonius, who I think was another senator. He may have just been a commander. I can't remember. But allegedly he said this to Caesar after he crossed the Rubicon. The die is cast. You have now made your decision. You've crossed your Rubicon. There's no going back now. So all of that weight comes to bear anytime somebody says the die is cast or thrown a die. A rubber, when you're talking about card games, is a set of 3 games. So I think you can have a rubber of bridge where you play three games. That's a rubber, and then you can take a break. And that is it. That's everything. All right, let's listen to chapter 9 of Emma by Jane Austen. If you are listening to your own version, please fast forward to 44 minutes and 57 seconds. And that's it. Let's go. Let's listen. Here we go.
Chapter 9. Mr. Knightley might quarrel with her, but Emma could not quarrel with herself. He was so much displeased that it was longer than usual before he came to Hartfield again, and when they did meet, his grave looks showed that she was not forgiven. She was sorry, but could not repent. On the contrary, her plans and proceedings were more and more justified and endeared to her by the general appearances of the next few days. The picture, elegantly framed, came safely to hand soon after Mr. Elton's return, and being hung over the mantelpiece of the common sitting-room, he got up to look at it, and sighed out his half-sentences of admiration just as he ought. And as for Harriet's feelings, they were visibly forming themselves into as strong and steady an attachment as her youth and sort of mind admitted. Emma was soon perfectly satisfied of Mr. Martin's being no otherwise remembered than as he furnished a contrast with Mr. Elton of the utmost advantage to the latter. Her views of improving her little friend's mind by a great deal of useful reading and conversation had never yet led to more than a few first chapters and the intention of going on to-morrow. It was much easier to chat than to study, much pleasanter to let her imagination range and work at Harriet's fortune than to be labouring to enlarge her comprehension or exercise it on sober facts. And the only literary pursuit which engaged Harriet at present, the only mental provision she was making for the evening of life, was the collecting and transcribing all the riddles of every sort that she could meet with into a thin quarto of hot-pressed paper, made up by her friend, and ornamented with ciphers and trophies. In this age of literature such collections on a very grand scale are not uncommon. Miss Nash, head teacher at Mrs. Goddard's, had written out at least 300, and Harriet, who had taken the first hint of it from her, hoped with Miss Woodhouse's help to get a great many more. Emma assisted with her invention, memory, and taste, and as Harriet wrote a very pretty hand, it was likely to be an arrangement of the first order, in form as well as quantity. Mr. Woodhouse was almost as much interested in the business as the girls, and tried very often to recollect something worth their putting in. "So many clever riddles as there used to be when he was young, he wondered he could not remember them, but he hoped he should in time." And it always ended in "Kitty, a fair but frozen maid." His good friend Perry, too, whom he had spoken to on the subject, did not at present recollect anything of the riddle kind, but he had desired Perry to be upon the watch, and as he went about so much, something, he thought, might come from that quarter. It was by no means his daughter's wish that the intellects of Highbury in general should be put under requisition. Mr. Elton was the only one whose assistance she asked. He was invited to contribute any really good enigmas, charades, or conundrums that he might recollect, and she had the pleasure of seeing him most intently at work with his recollections, and at the same time, as she could perceive, most earnestly careful that nothing ungallant, nothing that did not breathe a compliment to the sex, should pass his lips. They owed to him their 2 or 3 politest puzzles, and the joy and exultation with which at last he recalled, and rather sentimentally recited, that well-known charade, "My first doth affliction denote, which my second is destined to feel, and my whole is the best antidote that affliction to soften and heal," made her quite sorry to acknowledge that they had transcribed it some pages ago already. "Why will not you write one yourself for us, Mr. Elton?" said she. "That is the only security for its freshness, and nothing could be easier to you." No, no, he had never written, hardly ever, anything of the kind in his life. The stupidest fellow, he was afraid not even Miss Woodhouse— he stopped a moment— or Miss Smith could inspire him. The very next day, however, he produced some proof of inspiration. He called for a few moments, just to leave a piece of paper on the table, containing, as he said, a charade, which a friend of his had addressed to a young lady, the object of his admiration, but which, from his manner, Emma was immediately convinced must be his own. "I do not offer it for Miss Smith's collection," said he. "Being my friends, I have no right to expose it in any degree to the public eye, but perhaps you may not dislike looking at it." The speech was more to Emma than to Harriet, which Emma could understand. There was deep consciousness about him, and he found it easier to meet her eye than her friend's. He was gone the next moment, after another moment's pause. "Take it," said Emma, smiling, and pushing the paper towards Harriet. "It is for you. Take your own." But Harriet was in a tremor, and could not touch it, and Emma, never loath to be first, was obliged to examine it herself. To Miss Charade. My first displays the wealth and pomp of kings, lords of the earth, their luxury and ease. Another view of man my second brings, behold him there, the monarch of the seas. But united, what reverse we have! Man's boasted power and freedom all are flown. Lord of the earth and sea, he bends a slave, and woman, lovely woman, reigns alone. Thy ready wit the word will soon supply, may its approval beam in that soft eye. She cast her eye over it, pondered, caught the meaning, read it through again to be quite certain, and quite mistress of the lines, and then, passing it to Harriet, sat happily smiling and saying to herself, while Harriet was puzzling over the paper in all the confusion of hope and dulness, "Very well, Mr. Elton, very well indeed. I have read worse charades. Courtship, a very good hint. I give you credit for it. This is feeling your way. This is saying very plainly, Pray, Miss Smith, give me leave to pay my addresses to you, approve my charade and my intentions in the same glance. May its approval beam in that soft eye. Harriet, exactly. Soft is the very word for her eye, of all epithets the justest that could be given. Thy ready wit the word will soon supply. Harriet's ready wit, all the better. A man must be very much in love indeed to describe her so. Ah, Mr. Knightley, I wish you had the benefit of this. I think this would convince you. For once in your life you would be obliged to own yourself mistaken. An excellent charade indeed, and very much to the purpose. Things must come to a crisis soon now. She was obliged to break off from these very pleasant observations, which were otherwise of a sort to run into great length, by the eagerness of Harriet's wondering questions. "What can it be, Miss Woodhouse? What can it be? I have not an idea. I cannot guess it in the least. What can it possibly be? Do try to find it out, Miss Woodhouse. Do help me. I never saw anything so hard. Is it kingdom? I wonder who the friend was, and who could be the young lady. Do you think it is a good one? Can it be woman? And woman, lovely woman, reigns alone. Can it be Neptune? Behold him there, the monarch of the seas. Or a trident, or a mermaid, or a shark? Oh no, shark is only one syllable. It must be very clever, or he would not have brought it. Oh, Miss Woodhouse, do you think we shall ever find it out?
Mermaids and sharks? Nonsense! My dear Harriet, what are you thinking of? Where would be the use of his bringing us a charade made by a friend upon a mermaid or a shark? Give me the paper and listen. For Miss Blank, read Miss Smith. My first displays the wealth and pomp of kings, lords of the earth, their luxury and ease. That is court. Another view of man my second brings. Behold him there, the monarch of the seas. That is ship, plain as it can be. Now for the cream. But united, courtship, you know, what reverse we have. Man's boasted power and freedom all are flown. Lord of the earth and sea, he bends a slave, and woman, lovely woman, reigns alone. A very proper compliment. And then follows the application, which I think, my dear Harriet, you cannot find much difficulty in comprehending. Read it in comfort to yourself. There can be no doubt of its being written for you and to you. Harriet could not long resist so delightful a persuasion. She read the concluding lines, and was all flutter and happiness. She could not speak. But she was not wanted to speak. It was enough for her to feel. Emma spoke for her. There is so pointed and so particular a meaning in this compliment, said she, that I cannot have a doubt as to Mr. Elton's intentions. You are his object, and you will soon receive the completest proof of it. I thought it must be so. I thought I could not be so deceived, but now it is clear. The state of his mind is as clear and decided as my wishes on the subject have been ever since I knew you. Yes, Harriet, just so long have I been wanting the very circumstance to happen which has happened. I could never tell whether an attachment between you and Mr. Elton were the most desirable or the most natural. Its probability and its eligibility have really so equalled each other. I am very happy. I congratulate you, my dear Harriet, with all my heart. This is an attachment which a woman may well feel pride in creating. This is a connection which offers nothing but good. It will give you everything that you want, consideration, independence, a proper home. It will fix you in the centre of all your real friends, close to Hartfield and to me, and confirm our intimacy for ever. This, Harriet, is an alliance which can never raise a blush in either of us. Dear Miss Woodhouse, and dear Miss Woodhouse, was all that Harriet, with many tender embraces, could articulate at first. But when they did arrive at something more like conversation, it was sufficiently clear to her friend that she saw, felt, anticipated, and remembered just as she ought. Mr. Elton's superiority had very ample acknowledgment. "Whatever you say is always right," cried Harriet, "and therefore I suppose, and believe, and hope it must be so. But otherwise I could not have imagined it. It is so much beyond anything I deserve. Mr. Elton, who might marry anybody. There cannot be two opinions about him. He is so very superior. Only think of those sweet verses, to Miss Blank. Dear me, how clever! Could it really be meant for me? I cannot make a question, or listen to a question about that. It is a certainty. Receive it on my judgment. It is a sort of prologue to the play, a motto to the chapter, and will soon be followed by matter-of-fact prose. It is a sort of thing which nobody could have expected, I am sure, a month ago. I had no more idea myself. The strangest things do take place. When Miss Smiths and Mr. Eltons get acquainted, they do indeed, and really it is strange. It is out of the common course that what is so evidently, so palpably desirable, what courts the prearrangement of other people, should so immediately shape itself into the proper form. You and Mr. Elton are by situation called together. You belong to one another by every circumstance of your respective homes. Your marrying will be the equal to the match at Randalls. There does seem to be a something in the air of Hartfield which gives love exactly the right direction, and sends it into the very channel where it ought to flow. The course of true love never did run smooth. A Hartfield edition of Shakespeare would have a long note on that passage. That Mr. Elton should really be in love with me of all people, who did not know him, to speak to him at Michaelmas, and he the very handsomest man that ever was, and a man that everybody looks up to, quite like Mr. Knightley. His company so sought after, that everybody says he need not eat a single meal by himself if he does not choose it, that he has more invitations than there are days in the week, and so excellent in the church. Miss Nash has put down all the texts he has ever preached from since he came to Highbury. Dear me, when I look back to the first time I saw him, how little did I think! The two abbots and I ran into the front room and peeped through the blind when we heard he was going by, and Miss Nash came and scolded us away, and stayed to look through herself. However, she called me back presently, and let me look too, which was very good-natured. And how beautiful we thought he looked! He was arm in arm with Mr. Cole. This is an alliance which, whoever, whatever your friends may be, must be agreeable to them, provided at least they have common sense, and we are not to be addressing our conduct to fools. If they are anxious to see you happily married, here is a man whose amiable character gives us every assurance of it. If they wish to have you settled in the same country and circle which they have chosen to place you in, here it will be accomplished, and if their only object is that you should, in the common phrase, be well married, here is the comfortable fortune, the respectable establishment, the rise in the world which must satisfy them. Yes, very true. How nicely you talk! I love to hear you. You understand everything. You and Mr. Elton are of one as clever as the other. This charade! If I had studied a 12-month, I could never have made anything like it. I thought he meant to try his skill by his manner of declining it yesterday. I do think it is, without exception, the best charade I ever read. I never read one more to the purpose, certainly. It is as long again as almost all we have had before. I do not consider its length as particularly in its favour. Such things in general cannot be too short. Harriet was too intent on the lines to hear. The most satisfactory comparisons were rising in her mind. It is one thing, said she presently, her cheeks in a glow, to have very good sense in a common way, like everybody else, and if there is anything to say, to sit down and write a letter, and say just what you must in a short way, and another to write verses and charades like this. Emma could not have desired a more spirited rejection of Mr. Martin's prose. Such sweet lines, continued Harriet, these two last. But how shall I ever be able to return the paper, or say I have found it out? Oh, Miss Woodhouse, what can we do about that? Leave it to me. You do nothing. He will be here this evening, I dare say, and then I will give it him back, and some nonsense or other will pass between us, and you shall not be committed. Your soft eyes shall choose their own time for beaming. Trust to me. Oh, Miss Woodhouse, what a pity that I must not write this beautiful charade into my book. I am sure I have not got one half so good. Leave out the last two lines, and there is no reason why you should not write it into your book. Oh, but those two lines are the best of all, granted, for private enjoyment, and for private enjoyment keep them. They are not at all the less written, you know, because you divide them. The couplet does not cease to be, nor does its meaning change. but take it away and all appropriation ceases, and a very pretty gallant charade remains, fit for any collection. Depend upon it, he would not like to have his charade slighted much better than his passion. A poet in love must be encouraged in both capacities, or neither. Give me the book, I will write it down, and then there can be no possible reflection on you." Harriet submitted, though her mind could hardly separate the parts, so as to feel quite sure that her friend were not writing down a declaration of love. It seemed too precious an offering for any degree of publicity. "I shall never let that book go out of my own hands," said she. "Very well," replied Emma, "a most natural feeling, and the longer it lasts the better I shall be pleased. But here is my father coming. You will not object to my reading the charade to him? It will be giving him so much pleasure. He loves anything of the sort, and especially anything that pays a woman a compliment. He has the tenderest spirit of gallantry towards us all. You must let me read it to him." Harriet looked grave. "My dear Harriet, you must not refine too much upon this charade. You will betray your feelings improperly if you are too conscious and too quick, and appear to fix more meaning, or even quite all the meaning which may be affixed to it. Do not be overpowered by such a little tribute of admiration. If he had been anxious for secrecy, he would not have left the paper while I was by. But he rather pushed it towards me than towards you. Do not let us be too solemn on the business. He has encouragement enough to proceed, without our sighing out our souls over this charade." "Oh, no, I hope I shall not be ridiculous about it. Do as you please." Mr. Woodhouse came in, and very soon led to the subject again by the recurrence of his very frequent inquiry of, "Well, my dears, how does your book go on? Have you got anything fresh?" "Yes, papa, we have something to read you, and something quite fresh. A piece of paper was found on the table this morning, dropped, we suppose, by a fairy, containing a very pretty charade, and we have just copied it in." She read it to him just as he liked to have anything read, slowly and distinctly, and 2 or 3 times over, with explanations of every part as she proceeded, and he was very much pleased, and, as she had foreseen, especially struck with the complimentary conclusion. "Ay, that's very just indeed, that's very properly said, very true. Woman, lovely woman. It is such a pretty charade, my dear, that I can easily guess what fairy brought it. Nobody could have written so prettily but you, Emma." Emma only nodded and smiled. After a little thinking and a very tender sigh, he added, "Ah, it is no difficulty to see who you take after. Your dear mother was so clever at all those things, if I had but her memory. But I can remember nothing, not even that particular riddle which you have heard me mention. I can only recollect the first stanza, and there are several. Kitty, a fair but frozen maid, kindled a flame I yet deplore. The hoodwinked boy I called to aid, though of his near approach afraid, so fatal to my suit before. And that is all that I can recollect of it. But it is very clever all the way through. But I think, my dear, you said you had got it." "Yes, papa, it is written out on our second page. We copied it from the Elegant Extracts. It was Garrick's, you know." "Ay, very true. I wish I could recollect more of it. Kitty, a fair but frozen maid. The name makes me think of poor Isabella, for she was very near being christened Catherine after her grandmamma. I hope we shall have her here next week. Have you thought, my dear, where you shall put her, and what room there will be for the children?" "Oh, yes, she will have her own room, of course, the room she always has, and there is the nursery for the children, just as usual, you know. Why should there be any change?" "I do not know, my dear, but it is so long since she was here, not since last Easter, and then only for a few days. Mr. John Knightley's being a lawyer is very inconvenient. Poor Isabella! She is sadly taken away from us all, and how sorry she will be when she comes not to see Miss Taylor here." "She will not be surprised, papa, at least." "I do not know, my dear. I am sure I was very much surprised when I first heard she was going to be married." "We must ask Mr. and Mrs. Weston to dine with us while Isabella is here." "Yes, my dear, if there is time. But," in a very depressed tone, "she is coming only for 1 week. There will not be time for anything." "It is unfortunate that they cannot stay longer. But it seems a case of necessity. Mr. John Knightley must be in town again on the 28th, and we ought to be thankful, papa, that we are to have the whole of the time they can give to the country, that 2 or 3 days are not to be taken out for the Abbey. Mr. Knightley promises to give up his claim this Christmas, though you know it is longer since they were with him than with us.
It would be very hard indeed, my dear, if poor Isabella were to be anywhere but at Hartfield.
Mr. Woodhouse could never allow for Mr. Knightley's claims on his brother, or anybody's claims on Isabella except his own. He sat musing a little while, and then said,
"But I do not see why poor Isabella should be obliged to go back so soon, though he does. I think, Emma, I shall try and persuade her to stay longer with us. She and the children might stay very well."
"Ah, papa, that is what you have never been able to accomplish, and I do not think you ever will. Isabella cannot bear to stay behind her husband." This was too true for contradiction. Unwelcome as it was, Mr. Woodhouse could give only a submissive sigh, and as Emma saw his spirits affected by the idea of his daughter's attachment to her husband, she immediately led to such a branch of the subject as must raise them. "Harriet must give us as much of her company as she can while my brother and sister are here. I am sure she will be pleased with the children. We are very proud of the children, are we not, papa? I wonder which she will think the handsomest, Henry or John?"
"Ay, I wonder which she will. Poor little dears, how glad they will be to come. They are very fond of being at Hartfield, Harriet."
"I dare say they are, sir. I am sure I do not know who is not."
"Henry is a fine boy, but John is very like his mamma. Henry is the eldest. He was named after me, not after his father. John, the second, is named after his father. Some people are surprised, I believe, that the eldest was not, but Isabella would have him called Henry, which I thought very pretty of her. And he is a very clever boy indeed. They are all remarkably clever, and they have so many pretty ways. They will come and stand by my chair and say, 'Grandpapa, can you give me a bit of string?' And once Henry asked me for a knife, but I told him knives were only made for grandpapas. I think their father is too rough with them very often."
"He appears rough to you," said Emma, "because you are so very gentle yourself, but if you could compare him with other papas, you would not think him rough. He wishes his boys to be active and hardy, and if they misbehave, he can give them a sharp word now and then, but he is an affectionate father. Certainly, Mr. John Knightley is an affectionate father. The children are all fond of him."
"And then their uncle comes in and tosses them up to the ceiling in a very frightful way."
"But they like it, papa. There is nothing they like so much. It is such enjoyment to them, that if their uncle did not lay down the rule of their taking turns, whichever began would never give way to the other."
"Well, I cannot understand it."
"That is the case with us all, papa. One half of the world cannot understand the pleasures of the other." Later in the morning, and just as the girls were going to separate in preparation for the regular 4 o'clock dinner, the hero of this inimitable charade walked in again. Harriet turned away, but Emma could receive him with the usual smile, and her quick eye soon discerned in his the consciousness of having made a push, of having thrown a die, and she imagined he was come to see how it might turn up. His ostensible reason, however, was to ask whether Mr. Woodhouse's party could be made up in the evening without him, or whether he should be in the smallest degree necessary at Hartfield. If he were, everything else must give way, but otherwise his friend Cole had been saying so much about dining with him, had made such a point of it, that he had promised him conditionally to come. Emma thanked him, but could not allow of his disappointing his friend on their account. Her father was sure of his rubber. He re-urged, she re-declined, and he seemed then about to make his bow, when, taking the paper from the table, she returned it. "Oh, here's the charade you were so obliging as to leave with us. Thank you for the sight of it. We admired it so much that I have ventured to write it into Miss Smith's collection. Your friend will not take it amiss, I hope. Of course I have not transcribed beyond the first 8 lines." Mr. Elton certainly did not very well know what to say. He looked rather doubtingly, rather confused, said something about honour, glanced at Emma and at Harriet, and then, seeing the book open on the table, took it up and examined it very attentively. With the view of passing off an awkward moment, Emma smilingly said, "You must make my apologies to your friend, but so good a charade must not be confined to 1 or 2. He may be sure of every woman's approbation while he writes with such gallantry."
"I have no hesitation in saying," replied Mr. Elton, though hesitating a good deal while he spoke, "I have no hesitation in saying, at least if my friend feels at all as I do, I have not the smallest doubt that, could he see his little effusion honoured as I see it—"
looking at the book again and replacing it on the table. "He would consider it as the proudest moment of his life." After this speech he was gone as soon as possible. Emma could not think it too soon, for with all his good and agreeable qualities, there was a sort of parade in his speeches which was very apt to incline her to laugh. She ran away to indulge the inclination, leaving the tender and the sublime of pleasure to Harriet's share. End of chapter 9.
So this may be one of the only chapters in Emma where I actually feel sorry for Elton. Clearly, his little charade written by a friend was not meant for everyone's consumption. And then finding out that it was written by Emma into Harriet's commonplace book, except for the last 2 lines, which to him would have been the most important 2 lines, the poor guy is just completely flummoxed. Didn't hesitate to say, although he hesitated quite a bit, what now? I did kind of feel bad for him about that. But going back to the beginning, the first riddle that we get is listed as a well-known charade, and that is, "My first doth affliction denote." An affliction is woe, W-O-E, which my second is destined to feel. Man feels woe. And my whole, both those words combined, is the best antidote that affliction to soften and heal, which is woman. Isn't that lovely? So that was one that was written in a lot of people's commonplace books. That was the old chestnut. But then we get to poor Elton, and I don't know if you could tell from the way the recording was done. It's 2 miss and then an underline, a blank, and it's called charade, all caps. And Emma does go through this. The first 2 lines: "My first displays the wealth and pomp of kings, lords of the earth, their luxury and ease," which is court, like royal court. "Another view of man, my second brings, behold him there, the monarch of the seas," a ship, a sailing ship. "But united," courtship. "What reverse we have, man's boasted power and freedom all are flown. Lord of the earth and sea, he bends a slave, and woman, lovely woman, reigns alone," which is probably hearkening back to another song from actually The Vicar of Wakefield, "Woman, lovely woman." But then the 2 lines that Emma eventually cuts from Harriet's book the 2 lines are, "Thy ready wit the word will soon supply. May its approval beam in that soft eye." Now, it's not a horribly parsed poem. He's not embarrassing himself with the poem at all. It's, I can tell you, not up to Jane Austen's standards, because I can sit and look at her riddles and charades that I've come across, and I can look at them all day and just go, what? But we're not in the practice of parsing these things out. "Thy ready wit the word will soon supply." I do like that Emma stumbled over that and going, really, Harriet? I mean, I guess you must really be in love if you think that she's witty. Now, there's a line that comes up on the next page, and I'm going to use this line to help me prove my thesis on a later one of the riddles. Emma's thinking this was an excellent charade from Elton. Indeed, very much to the purpose. Things must come to a crisis soon now. And she doesn't mean crisis like it's all going to fall apart. Crisis like the action is going to start. This is going to be the climax of our story. Finally, actual love words will come out of Elton's mouth being aimed at Harriet, and they will get married and live happily ever after. That will be the crisis, the turning point. Crisis is kind of a big and powerful word to be used for something like a guy finally getting up the guts to say, "I love you." And that is a piece of my point that's coming up. I also thought, oh God, it was so hard listening to Harriet say, "Really? Do you really think he wrote this to me? I mean, whatever you say is always right." Oh, poor girl. But then there's the text that I wanted to go over with you is the one that Mr. Woodhouse refers to. So Kitty, Kitty, comma, a fair but frozen maid. Now, prior to 1970, all of the conversation around this particular riddle, written by David Garrick, first published in 1757. It was commonly understood that the cleverness with this riddle is that it looks like the answer must be Cupid. And I'll give you the whole thing to show you why that's true. Kitty, a fair but frozen maid, kindle the flame I still deplore. The hoodwinked boy, Cupid is often portrayed as having a blindfold on. The hoodwinked boy I'd call in aid, much of his near approach afraid, so fatal to my suit before. Totally could hear that being like the Cupid baby with the blindfold is aiming his bow and arrow straight at you, and oops. The next verse. At length, propitious to my prayer, the little urchin came. Again, little guy, sounds like a Cupid. At once he sought the midway air, and soon he cleared with dexterous care the bitter relics of my flame. So he got rid of any other love conflicts that the writer, David Garrick, may have had, and has now cleared the way for him to fall in love. So Kitty, Fanny now succeeds, so a new girl. And Fanny is a name of a character in Jane Austen's Mansfield Park. So we know that Kitty's in Pride and Prejudice, Fanny is in Mansfield Park. These are not names that are uncommon and therefore being used as a double entendre. To Kitty, Fanny now succeeds. She kindles slow but lasting fires. With care my appetite she feeds. Each day some willing victim bleeds to satisfy my strange desires. Strange here also is not strange like strange tales of the paranormal. This is strange like uncommon. It's a pretty standard way of using the word back then. And then say, by what title or what name must I this youth address? So again, youth, Cupid. But then the next line is, Cupid and he are not the same. Uh-oh. Though both can raise or quench a flame, I'll kiss you if you guess. The actual answer to this is actually a chimney sweep. I know. Let's go through this again. Kitty, a fair but frozen maid, kindled a flame I still deplore. So if Kitty is a maid, a housemaid, and she has kindled a flame in the fireplace that has been particularly smoky and has left a more thick than usual layer of creosote on the inside of the chimney pipe, means that you're going to have to bring in the hoodwinked boy, which is a kid. And by the way, I am going to link you out to an essay written by the Jane Austen Society that totally agrees with my take on this. I was so relieved to find it. It made me feel so much better. But they also have more details on chimney sweeps and how they were referred to in literature and in common parlance at the time. The little urchin came, the chimney sweep. He sought the midway air. He cleaned out the middle part of the chimney flue to get the air to come back down so you could draft the fire. Soon he cleared with dexterous care the bitter relics of my flame, the soot and the carbon and everything. And now Kitty has evidently been fired, and Fanny, a new maid, shows up. She knows how to kindle a slow but lasting fire. She feeds it regularly with new wood or coal, depending on what it was that you were burning. And then it still ends. Each day some willing victim bleeds to satisfy my strange desires. So here's the thing. Somewhere in the 70s, and I know I've talked about this before when I've talked about Jack and Jilling, a story that Mr. Sterrett, my high school AP teacher, gave us that English journal article, which we then used as a descriptor for when people took things a little bit too far with their trying to put a particular gloss on a text. In that Jack and Jill one, it was all about how Jack and Jill is not actually this simple nursery rhyme. It's actually about the original sin and all sorts of sexual compromise and everything. I found that essay at some point. If I can find it again, I will put a link to it because it is something else to read. I mean, it had us all in stitches. The first couple paragraphs were like, wait, what? And then it just was laughter after that. But I think in the 70s, there were some scholars who kind of Jack and Jilled this moment in Emma as well. I think there are a lot of people who are probably looking to make, I don't want to say to make Jane Austen sexy, but there are plenty of people who would, in the world today too, who would like to assign questionable motives to people who mean nothing more than something very innocent and straightforward. Several of the readings of this David Garrick text now indicate that it is about venereal disease, syphilis, the burning flame. All of these things, I guess, if you really want to take this round peg and fit it into a square hole, I'm sure you can, but it's missing several things. The people who came up with these theories didn't know that, like, hoodwinked was a term that was used with chimney sweeps. This is something that people back then would have known, but that we don't. And it's mistakes like that. It's just like people thinking that some of the Old Testament, the most prophetic books of the Testament, the Old Testament, were written when the Hebrews at the time were in exile. And so they were strangers in a strange land. They wanted to get home. They weren't talking about going home to heaven, dying and going to heaven. They were talking about going to home. And if you don't know the history of the people who are writing those books, then it's going to be very easy to misinterpret some of that stuff. So this is another one of those places where the first time I read this chapter, I was like, okay, I got to find out what this is that Mr. Woodhouse is so fixated on that he can't remember it. And Kitty, a fair but frozen maid, of course, in my mind, I too started to think, I wonder if he can't remember it because it's a little blue, it's a little risque. But actually, the kinds of jokes and riddles that were popular at this time went the other direction. They sounded like a double entendre, but weren't. So that if somebody came back and said, whoa, what's this all about? Now you could say, oh, you filthy thing. How could you think that? It's really about, in this case, a chimney sweep. The Georgians were certainly more prone to doing that kind of humor than going the other direction, where you hide something scandalous in otherwise innocent sounding texts. And I think that this interpretation, my interpretation, and the Jane Austen Society's interpretation, lands a lot closer to Jane Austen's style of cleverness and language use. She doesn't need to rely on veiled dirty jokes to be funny. Thank you very much, says Jane. So yeah, by the end of the chapter, Emma continues to be clueless about Elton. She thinks that everything is just hunky-dory between him and Harriet and moving along in the right direction. Poor Elton is completely gobsmacked. You took out the last two lines. Those are the ones that talk about you, Emma. And can I see the book? And he looks at it and, wow, you really did cut those last two lines out. Okay. And then, oh, Emma. After his speech, he was gone as soon as possible. Emma could not think it too soon, for with all his good and agreeable qualities, there was a sort of parade in his speeches which was very apt to incline her to laugh. Mr. Elton. I mean, he's not my favorite guy, but you do kind of feel bad for him because he thinks he's fitting in perfectly, and yet he's missing the mark, certainly with Emma, especially if his rambling makes her laugh. She ran away to indulge the inclination, leaving the tender and the sublime of pleasure to Harriet's share. So she went off to continue kind of giggling about how glad she is that Elton is hot for Harriet, and let Harriet just enjoy the glow. And that is where our chapter ends today. By the time you've listened to this, we will have done our Howl's Moving Castle book talk, which is Thursday night. I hope I got to see some of you there. I'm very excited about that. And don't forget, this is the last episode before we pick the winners for the gorgeous coasters and bookmarks from listener Susan. So Don't forget, follow the link in the show notes if you would like to enter that particular raffle. And there we are. I'm going to go to sleep. You take care of yourself. Have a great one. I'll talk to you soon. Bye. If you like what we do here, please consider liking and subscribing on iTunes, thumbs upping and subscribing on YouTube. You can visit patreon.com/craftlit and become a patron of this art. And you can always go to Linktree, linktr.ee/craftlit channel. And from there, you can get links out to all of the social media, all of the places that CraftLit lives. It's a nice hub that you can go to get all the stuff, all the good stuff. And I keep forgetting to mention, we also have a Facebook group with the loveliest group of people, as you might imagine. They're just awesome, makers and readers, and people who hadn't been readers before, but are now. I like that. All right, you take care of yourself. Have a great one. I'll talk to you soon. Bye.